Wellington III adjusted his Italian silk tie as he stepped out of his black Continental GT. The morning sun reflected off the polished chrome, casting shadows across the circular driveway of his $40 million mansion in Beverly Hills. At 38 years old, had built an empire that spanned technology, real estate, and international investments. His net worth had recently crossed the $12 billion mark, making him one of the youngest billionaires in California. The mansion stood like a monument to his success, with its marble columns, infinity pools, and manicured gardens that stretched for acres. Inside, the home boasted 23 rooms, each decorated with priceless art and furniture that cost more than most people's homes. Had worked tirelessly to build his fortune, starting with a small tech company in his garage 15 years ago. Now, Wellington Industries was a global powerhouse with offices in 37 countries. But success had come with a price, had become increasingly isolated, surrounded by people who either wanted something from him or were intimidated by his wealth. His relationships were superficial, his friendships were business arrangements, and his romantic life was a series of brief encounters with women who were more interested in his bank account than his personality. The loneliness had made him cynical, suspicious, and unfortunately, somewhat arrogant. As he walked through the front entrance, his personal assistant, Jennifer, greeted him with his usual morning briefing. She rattled off his schedule for the day, which included board meetings, conference calls with investors in Tokyo, and a charity gala that evening where he would make his obligatory appearance for good publicity. Barely listened, his mind already focused on the challenging negotiations he had planned for the week. The household staff moved around him like ghosts, trained to be invisible and efficient. There was Mrs., his elderly housekeeper who had worked for the previous owner of the mansion. There was Carlos, his groundskeeper who maintained the extensive gardens. There was Chef, who prepared his meals with precision and artistry. And there was Maria Santos, the addition to his household staff. Maria had been working as his personal maid for only 6 weeks. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and graying hair that she kept neatly pulled back. She wore the standard uniform provided to all household staff, a simple gray dress with white collar and cuffs. What noticed most about her was her quiet efficiency and her accent, which he had dismissed as typical of what he assumed was her limited education and background. Had hired Maria through his usual employment agency, which specialized in domestic help for wealthy families. Her references were excellent, her background check was clean, and she had experience working in high-end households. What the employment file didn't mention, and what never bothered to ask about, was Maria's remarkable background and the circumstances that had led her to domestic work. On this particular Tuesday morning was in an especially foul mood. The stock market had opened poorly. One of his major investments was underperforming, and he had received news that a competitor was trying to poach some of his key employees. His usual breakfast of steel-cut oats with fresh berries and organic honey sat untouched as he barked orders into his phone. Maria entered the dining room to clear the breakfast dishes, moving quietly and efficiently as always. She had learned to read the moods of her wealthy employer and knew when to be even more invisible than usual. As she reached for his coffee cup, suddenly slammed his phone down on the table, startling her and causing her to accidentally knock over the small crystal vase that held a single white orchid. The vase shattered on the marble floor, sending fragments of crystal across the dining room. Water pooled around the broken pieces, and the delicate orchid lay bruised among the debris. Maria immediately dropped to her knees, frantically trying to collect the sharp pieces while apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wellington. I'm so very sorry. I'll replace it immediately. Please forgive me," she said in her accented English, her voice trembling with embarrassment and fear. Stood up abruptly, his face red with anger that had been building all morning. The broken vase was just a trigger for his frustration with everything else going wrong in his business life. He looked down at Maria, who was still on her hands and knees picking up crystal fragments, and something ugly rose up inside him. "Are you kidding me right now?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Do you have any idea what that vase cost? Do you think you can just waltz in here with your clumsy hands and break my things?" Maria looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with shock at his outburst. She had worked for demanding employers before, but none had spoken to her with such venom. "Sir, I truly apologize. It was an accident. I will pay for the replacement from my salary." Laughed bitterly. "Your salary? Do you know that vase was worth more than you make in 6 months? It was handcrafted by a master artisan in Venice." but I suppose someone like you wouldn't understand the value of fine craftsmanship." The words hung in the air like poison. Maria's face flushed with humiliation, but she continued cleaning up the mess, her movements now slower and more deliberate. The other staff members had heard the commotion and were watching from doorways, their faces reflecting their discomfort with their employer's behavior. "Maybe if you people learned to pay attention instead of just going through the motions, things like this wouldn't happen," continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know why I bother trying to maintain standards in this house when I'm surrounded by people who clearly don't appreciate quality." Mrs., who had been with the household for 15 years, cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Wellington, perhaps we could." "Perhaps you could mind your own business," Mrs. snapped. "I'm dealing with this situation." He turned back to Maria, who had finished collecting the larger pieces and was now carefully dabbing at the water with a cloth napkin. "You know what your problem is?" said, his voice taking on a particularly nasty tone. "You people think you can just coast through life without really applying yourselves. You take these jobs because they're easy, because you don't have to think or learn or improve yourselves. You're content to just clean up after your betters and collect a paycheck." Maria stopped what she was doing and looked up at him. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, but she said nothing. She simply returned to her task, her silence somehow more dignified than any response she could have given. "I mean, let's be honest here," continued, encouraged by what he mistook for submission. "What's your highest level of education? High school? Did you even finish high school? I doubt you could even spell craftsmanship, let alone understand what it means." The room had gone completely silent, except for the sound of his voice and the gentle clinking of crystal pieces being placed in Maria's cupped hand. Even the usual household sounds seemed to have stopped, as if the entire mansion was holding its breath. "You come here with your limited English and your simple understanding of the world, and you expect to work in a house filled with priceless artifacts and sophisticated systems. Maybe that's the real problem here. Maybe I need to find staff who can actually appreciate what they're working with." Maria stood up slowly, the broken crystal carefully contained in the cloth napkin. Her face was calm, but there was a new quality to her stillness that was too angry to notice. She walked to the sideboard and disposed of the debris in a small waste basket that she would later empty. "I'll have a replacement vase ordered immediately, sir," she said quietly. "I take full responsibility for my carelessness." Shook his head in disgust. "Don't bother, I'll handle it myself. I need to make sure it's done right." He picked up his briefcase and headed toward the door, then paused and turned back. "And Maria, try to remember that this isn't some cheap motel you're cleaning. Everything in this house has value and meaning. Maybe if you understood that, you'd be more careful." With that, he strode out of the dining room, leaving Maria standing alone among the remaining staff members. The silence stretched for several moments before Mrs. approached her. "Don't let him get to you, dear," the older woman whispered. "He's been under a lot of stress lately with his business dealings. He doesn't usually speak to us like that." Maria nodded politely, but her expression remained unreadable. She excused herself and went to get the proper cleaning supplies to ensure no crystal fragments remained on the marble floor. As she worked, the other staff members gradually returned to their duties, but the atmosphere in the house remained tense. What didn't know, what he had never bothered to discover, was that Maria Santos held a doctorate in international economics from the London School of Economics. She spoke 9 languages fluently and had spent 20 years working as a senior analyst for the World Bank before her life took an unexpected turn. She had been born in Colombia to a family of educators and had shown exceptional academic promise from an early age. Her father had been a university professor, her mother a translator for the United Nations. Maria had grown up in a household where multiple languages were spoken daily and where intellectual curiosity was encouraged and celebrated. She had earned scholarships to study in London, where she excelled in her studies and developed expertise in global financial markets and international trade agreements. For 2 decades, Maria had advised governments and multinational corporations on complex economic policies. She had been present at G7 summits, had briefed heads of state, and had authored papers that influenced international monetary policy. Her colleagues had respected her insights, and her recommendations had helped shape trade agreements worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But life had dealt her a series of unexpected blows. Her husband, also an economist, had died suddenly of a heart attack 3 years earlier. Her daughter, studying medicine had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease that required expensive treatments not fully covered by insurance. Maria's savings had been depleted, and despite her qualifications, age discrimination in her field had made it difficult to find positions that paid enough to cover her daughter's medical expenses. Pride had initially prevented her from taking domestic work, but desperation and love for her daughter had eventually overcome her reservations. She had discovered that working for wealthy families paid better than many other options available to her, and the work allowed her to maintain the flexible schedule she needed to care for her daughter during medical appointments. So here she was, one of the most qualified economists of her generation, cleaning the floors of a mansion owned by a man who assumed she was ignorant and uneducated. The irony was not lost on her, but she endured it because her daughter's life was more important than her pride. As she finished cleaning the dining room, Maria reflected on Wellington's words. She had encountered arrogance and prejudice before, but rarely so blatantly displayed. She understood that, saw her uniform and heard her accent and made immediate assumptions about her intelligence and capabilities. It was a common enough prejudice, one that she had experienced in various forms throughout her career. But there was something particularly galling about being lectured on the value of quality and craftsmanship by a man whose wealth had been built on the very global economic systems she had helped design. Wellington's international investments were successful partly because of trade agreements and monetary policies that Maria had influenced during her years at the World Bank. Still, she needed this job. Her daughter's next treatment was scheduled for the following month, and the cost would be substantial. Maria could not afford to let her pride jeopardize her daughter's health. She would endure Wellington's condescension and ignorance because she had no choice. That afternoon, as sat in his home office reviewing financial reports, he noticed Maria working quietly in the hallway outside his door. She was dusting the antique furniture with careful attention to detail, treating each piece with the respect he felt they deserved. For a moment, he felt a slight twinge of guilt about his outburst that morning. Perhaps he had been too harsh. But then he remembered the broken vase and the stress of his current business challenges, and the guilt faded. He convinced himself that clear standards needed to be maintained, that his household staff needed to understand the level of excellence expected in his home. If Maria couldn't handle that, perhaps she wasn't the right fit for his household. What didn't realize was that his assumptions about Maria were about to cost him far more than a crystal vase. In fact, his prejudice and arrogance were setting him up for what could become the most expensive mistake of his career. The global economy was shifting in ways that would soon directly impact investments, particularly his holdings in emerging markets. Political tensions were rising, currency fluctuations were becoming more volatile, and trade relationships were being renegotiated. These changes would require the kind of expertise that assumed he could buy from his team of highly paid consultants. But sometimes the most valuable expertise comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the people we dismiss most carelessly are the ones who could save us from our greatest mistakes. Wellington was about to learn this lesson in the most humbling way possible, and the education would begin with a phone call that would arrive. The phone rang at exactly 7:30 the next morning, jolting from his sleep. It was David, his chief investment officer, calling from the company's office. David's voice was tense and urgent in a way that immediately caught attention. "We have a serious problem," David said without preamble. "The Brazilian government just announced unexpected changes to their foreign investment policies. Our position in the infrastructure project is suddenly at risk. We're looking at potential losses in the hundreds of millions." Sat up in bed, instantly alert. The project was one of his largest international investments, a massive urban development initiative that had required nearly $800 million in capital. The project was supposed to be a cornerstone of his emerging markets portfolio, with projected returns that would significantly boost his company's performance for the next decade. "What kind of changes?" demanded, reaching for his laptop to check the international news feeds. "New restrictions on foreign ownership of critical infrastructure, revised tax structures for international investors, and most problematically, new requirements for local partnerships that we didn't anticipate," David explained. "Our legal team is scrambling to understand the full implications, but early analysis suggests we might be forced to either significantly restructure our investment or potentially divest entirely." His mind raced as he processed the information. He had based the investment on months of research and analysis conducted by some of the most expensive consulting firms in the world. They had assured him that the political climate in Brazil was stable and that foreign investment policies were unlikely to change significantly in the near term. "How did our analysts miss this?" asked, his voice rising with frustration. "I paid $500,000 for their political risk assessment. They told me Brazilian policy was stable through 2027. "I don't know," David admitted. "But what I do know is that we need to move fast. The new regulations take effect in 60 days, and if we don't have a compliance plan in place by then, we could face penalties that would make our losses even worse." Ended the call and immediately began making a series of urgent phone calls to his team of advisors. He spoke with his political risk consultants, his international lawyers, his economic analysts, and his government relations specialists. Each conversation brought more concerning news and fewer viable solutions. By 10 o'clock that morning was in full crisis mode. He had called an emergency meeting with his senior staff for noon, and he was frantically trying to gather as much information as possible about the Brazilian situation before then. His home office was scattered with printed reports. His computer screens were filled with news articles and financial data, and his stress level was reaching dangerous heights. It was during this chaos that Maria entered his office to deliver his morning coffee. Was so absorbed in his research that he barely acknowledged her presence. She set the coffee on his desk and began to quietly tidy the room, collecting the scattered papers and organizing them into neat stacks. As she worked, Maria couldn't help but notice the content of the documents. Her eyes caught on a report titled Brazilian Infrastructure Investment Analysis and another labeled Development Project Risk Assessment. Despite herself, she found her attention drawn to the financial projections and political analysis contained in the papers. From what she could see, consultants had made several fundamental errors in their assessment of Brazilian political dynamics. They had failed to account for the upcoming gubernatorial elections in state, had misunderstood the influence of certain political parties on foreign investment policy, and had completely overlooked recent statements by key economic ministers about infrastructure ownership. Maria had intimate knowledge of Brazilian economic policy from her years at the World Bank. She had worked directly with Brazilian government officials on similar infrastructure projects and understood the complex political factors that influenced their decision-making. She could see immediately that investment was in serious jeopardy, but she also knew that there were potential solutions that his consultants seemed unaware of. Looked up from his computer screen and noticed Maria studying one of his documents. His stress and frustration from the morning's revelations immediately transformed into anger. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "Those are confidential business documents. I don't recall giving you permission to read my private papers." Maria looked up, startled. She had been so absorbed in the familiar economic data that she had forgotten where she was and who she was supposed to be. "I apologize, Mr. Wellington. I was just organizing the papers and couldn't help but notice." "Couldn't help but notice what?" interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Were you perhaps planning to offer your expert analysis of international investment strategy? Do you have insights into Brazilian economic policy that my team of MBAs somehow missed?" The contempt in his voice was palpable. Maria felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she also felt a spark of indignation. She was, in fact, far more qualified to analyze Brazilian economic policy than most of its expensive consultants. She had spent 3 years working specifically on Latin American infrastructure development and had personal relationships with many of the officials who would be implementing the new regulations. "I was simply going to say that I noticed some information about Brazil," Maria replied carefully, trying to keep her voice level. "My family is from Colombia, so I have some familiarity with South American economic issues." Laughed dismissively. "Oh, really? And I suppose because you're from South America, you understand international finance. That's like saying I understand all of European economic policy because I vacationed in Paris last year." He stood up and walked around his desk, positioning himself so that he was looking down at Maria. His body language was deliberately intimidating, designed to reinforce the power dynamic between them. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice cold and condescending. "What you're looking at are complex financial instruments and political analyses that require years of specialized education to understand. These documents represent millions of dollars in investment decisions based on research conducted by some of the most brilliant minds in international finance. Mario remained silent, but continued his lecture, apparently enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. You see, this is exactly the kind of thing I was talking about yesterday. You people see some numbers and some words about a country you think you know, and you assume you understand what's happening. But real economic analysis requires sophisticated understanding of global markets, political systems, regulatory frameworks, and financial modeling. He picked up one of the reports and waved it dismissively. This document alone cost me $50,000 to produce. It was written by a team of analysts who have advanced degrees from the finest universities in the world. But somehow you think you can glance at it while dusting my office and have meaningful insights. His voice grew more cutting with each sentence. This is a perfect example of the problem with hearing people who don't understand their place. You're here to clean my house, not to pretend you're qualified to advise me on billion-dollar investments. Maybe if you focused on doing your actual job properly instead of trying to involve yourself in matters that are completely beyond your comprehension, we'd all be better off. Maria's hands were trembling slightly as she finished organizing the papers, but her voice remained steady. Of course, Mr. Wellington, I overstepped my bounds. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't, replied. And in the future, when you're working in my office, focus on cleaning and organizing without reading my confidential documents. I don't pay you to think about my business affairs. As Maria left the office, felt a surge of satisfaction. He had put her in her place and reinforced the appropriate boundaries between them. He returned to his research, confident that he was surrounded by qualified professionals who would help him navigate this crisis. But as the morning progressed, his confidence began to erode. Each conversation with his advisors brought more troubling news and fewer viable solutions. His political risk consultants admitted that they had underestimated the likelihood of policy changes. His legal team was struggling to interpret the new regulations. His economic analysts were having difficulty determining the full financial impact of the changes. By 11:30, was in a state of near panic. The emergency meeting with his senior staff was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and he still didn't have a clear understanding of his options or a strategy for minimizing his losses. The phone calls and research had only confirmed that his investment was in serious trouble. Meanwhile, Maria was working in the library adjacent to his office, where she could overhear fragments of his increasingly desperate phone conversations. She heard him pleading with consultants for solutions, offering to pay premium fees for expedited analysis, and growing more frustrated with each disappointing response. Despite his cruel treatment of her, Maria felt a professional sympathy for his situation. She had seen similar crises during her years at the World Bank, where wealthy investors had made decisions based on incomplete or outdated information. The difference was that in her previous role, she had been the expert called in to provide solutions. From what she had observed, his investment could potentially be saved, but it would require someone with deep understanding of Brazilian politics and personal relationships with key officials. It would also require moving quickly and strategically, taking advantage of certain provisions in the new regulations that his consultants seemed to have overlooked. But Maria remained silent, had made it clear that he considered her opinions worthless and her insights unwelcome. He had humiliated her for the second time in 2 days, reinforcing his belief that she was intellectually inferior and professionally irrelevant. She owed him nothing, and certainly not the benefit of her expertise. As noon approached, senior staff began arriving for the emergency meeting. Maria watched as expensive cars pulled into the circular driveway and well-dressed executives hurried into the house. These were the people trusted, the advisors he paid enormous fees to consult, the experts whose opinions he valued. David had flown in from overnight. Sarah Martinez, the head of international legal affairs, had driven up from the downtown office. Robert, the chief economist, had canceled a vacation to attend the meeting. These were highly credentialed professionals with impressive resumes and extensive experience. Greeted each of them with a mixture of urgency and expectation. These were his people, his team, the advisors who would help him solve this crisis and protect his investment. He ushered them into his private conference room, where they would spend the next several hours analyzing the situation and developing a response strategy. What didn't realize was that, while his expensive consultants were struggling to understand the nuances of Brazilian economic policy, the solution to his crisis was cleaning bathrooms just down the hall. Maria Santos had forgotten more about Latin American infrastructure investment than most of his advisors had ever learned, but prejudice and arrogance prevented him from recognizing the expertise that was right under his nose. As the meeting began, Maria continued her work throughout the house, occasionally overhearing raised voices and frustrated exclamations from the conference room. She heard demanding answers, his advisors admitting uncertainty, and the growing tension as the magnitude of the crisis became clear. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was one of the richest men in America, surrounded by some of the most expensive consultants money could buy, struggling to solve a problem that Maria could address in a matter of hours. But assumptions about her capabilities, based purely on her appearance and accent, prevented him from accessing the very expertise he desperately needed. The meeting stretched on through the afternoon with no clear resolution emerging. Stress was reaching dangerous levels, his investment was still at risk, and his confidence in his advisors was rapidly eroding. The clock was ticking, and with each passing hour his options were becoming more limited. As evening approached, dismissed his staff with instructions to continue researching potential solutions overnight. He remained in his office, staring at the financial projections and wondering how his carefully planned investment had become such a disaster so quickly. Maria knocked softly on his door to ask if he needed anything before she finished her shift, looked up at her with tired, frustrated eyes, seeing nothing more than a domestic worker asking about household matters. He waved her away dismissively, returning his attention to documents that his expensive experts still couldn't fully explain. What didn't know was that Maria had spent the afternoon mentally drafting a comprehensive solution to his crisis. She knew exactly which Brazilian officials needed to be contacted, which regulatory provisions could be leveraged, and which partnerships could be formed to not only save his investment, but potentially increase its value. But prejudice had built an impenetrable wall between himself and the expertise he needed. His assumptions about Maria's capabilities had blinded him to the possibility that his salvation might come from the most unexpected source. As Maria prepared to leave for the day, she reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her into contact with this crisis. She had the knowledge and connections to save Wellington's investment, but she also had her pride and her dignity, had made it clear that he considered her worthless, and she had no obligation to rescue him from the consequences of his own arrogance. The question was whether she would let her personal feelings prevent her from helping, or whether her professional ethics would compel her to offer assistance despite treatment of her. It was a decision that would not only affect financial future, but would also test Maria's own character and values. As she drove home that evening, Maria made her choice. Tomorrow, she would find a way to help M spend the worst night of his life staring at spreadsheets that made less sense with each passing hour. By 3 in the morning, he was surrounded by empty coffee cups, crumpled papers, and the growing realization that his team of expensive advisors had no viable solutions to offer. Every potential strategy they had proposed came with unacceptable risks or prohibitive costs. The project had been more than just an investment for. It was supposed to be his masterpiece, the deal that would establish Wellington Industries as a major player in emerging markets infrastructure. He had personally negotiated with Brazilian officials, had flown to 6 times over the past year, and had staked his reputation on the project's success. Now, with less than 60 days to comply with the new regulations, was facing the possibility of losing not just his initial $800 million investment, but potentially hundreds of millions more in penalties and legal fees. The financial impact would be devastating, but the damage to his reputation and his company's credibility would be even worse. When Maria arrived for work the next morning, she found still in his office, looking haggard and defeated. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were red from lack of sleep. The confident billionaire who had humiliated her 2 days earlier was nowhere to be seen. As Maria began her morning routine, she could hear on a conference call with his legal team in. His voice was strained and desperate as he demanded answers they couldn't provide. The Brazilian lawyers were struggling to interpret the new regulations, and their recommendations were contradictory and uncertain. "What do you mean you're not sure?" shouted into the phone. I'm paying your firm $2,000 an hour for legal advice, and you're telling me you're not sure how to interpret a government regulation. Maria paused in her work, recognizing the frustration in his voice. She had heard similar conversations countless times during her career at the World Bank, when well-meaning but inexperienced advisors struggled with the complexities of Latin American regulatory environments. The truth was that the new Brazilian regulations were deliberately complex, designed to favor investors who understood the local political landscape and who had established relationships with key stakeholders. The regulations contained several provisions that could be leveraged by sophisticated investors, but only by those who understood the cultural and political context behind the legal language. Ended the call abruptly and slammed his phone down on the desk. He noticed Maria working quietly nearby and felt a surge of renewed anger. Here he was, facing the collapse of his most important investment, while his maid went about her simple tasks without a care in the world. "Must be nice," he said bitterly, his voice loud enough to ensure Maria heard him. "Must be nice to have such a simple life that you don't have to worry about anything more complicated than which furniture to dust next." Maria looked up, her expression carefully neutral. She had decided the night before that she would try to help, but his continued rudeness was testing her resolve. "Some of us," continued, apparently addressing his computer screen but clearly speaking for Maria's benefit, "have real responsibilities, real problems that require real intelligence to solve. Some of us can't just go through life in ignorant bliss." Despite her better judgment, Maria felt compelled to respond. "Mr. Wellington, if I may ask, what kind of problems are you facing?" Looked at her with surprise and renewed irritation. "What kind of problems? You wouldn't understand if I explained it to you. These are complex international business issues that require sophisticated understanding of global economics and political systems." "I might understand more than you think," Maria said quietly, setting down her cleaning supplies. "Perhaps if you told me about the situation, I could." "Are you serious right now?" interrupted, his voice rising again. "You think you can help me solve a billion-dollar international investment crisis? You can barely speak proper English, and you want to advise me on Brazilian economic policy." The insult stung, particularly because Maria's English was actually flawless, with only the slightest accent that reflected her multilingual background rather than any deficiency in her language skills. But she maintained her composure and tried a different approach. "I understand you're under a great deal of stress, Mr. Wellington. I only thought that perhaps an outside perspective might be helpful. Sometimes when we're too close to a problem, we miss simple solutions." Stood up and walked around his desk, his exhaustion making him even more aggressive than usual. "Simple solutions. Simple solutions. Do you think my team of MBAs and my consultants firm are missing simple solutions? Do you think the lawyers I'm paying thousands of dollars per hour haven't considered every possible angle?" He gestured toward the scattered documents on his desk. "This is a crisis that threatens my entire company. This is about regulatory compliance in one of the most complex economies in South America. This is about political relationships and international law and financial instruments that you couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand." Maria listened to his tirade without interrupting, watching as he paced around the office in his rumpled suit. When he finished, she spoke very quietly. "You're right, Mr. Wellington. I couldn't possibly understand the complexities of Brazilian regulatory policy or the intricacies of international infrastructure investment. I apologize for presuming to offer assistance with matters so far beyond my capabilities." Something in her tone caught his attention. There was a quality to her words that he couldn't quite identify, a subtle dignity that seemed out of place given their circumstances. But his exhaustion and stress made him dismiss the observation. "Good," he said, returning to his chair. "I'm glad we understand each other. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to continue working on problems that actually require my level of education and experience." Maria resumed her cleaning, but now she was listening more carefully to phone conversations. Over the next hour, she heard him speak with consultants in 3 different countries, each of whom offered partial solutions that came with significant risks or costs. None of them seemed to understand the political dynamics that drove the new regulations, and all of them were recommending approaches that would likely fail. During a break between calls, noticed that Maria was still in his office, moving quietly as she organized his bookshelf. He was about to ask her to leave when his phone rang again. This time it was the Brazilian Minister of Infrastructure Development's office, returning a call had made the previous day. The conversation was conducted in Portuguese, which had assumed Maria wouldn't understand. He spoke haltingly, using basic phrases he had learned for his business trips, clearly struggling to communicate complex ideas in a language he barely spoke. "Minister Santos," said, pronouncing the Portuguese words carefully, "I am very concerned about the new regulations for foreign investors. My company has invested many millions in the project, and we need to understand how to comply with the new requirements." The minister's responses were rapid and idiomatic, far beyond limited Portuguese comprehension. Found himself repeatedly asking for clarification or requesting that the minister speak more slowly. It was clearly a frustrating conversation for both parties. What didn't know was that Maria was listening to every word of the conversation, understanding both sides perfectly. Her Portuguese was fluent, developed during her years working with Brazilian officials at the World Bank. She could hear the minister's growing impatience with linguistic limitations and his inability to understand the subtle points of the new policy. More importantly, Maria recognized Minister Santos's voice. She had worked closely with him on two major infrastructure projects during her time at the World Bank. They had developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect, and she knew that he was reasonable and pragmatic in his approach to foreign investment issues. As struggled through the conversation, Maria realized that he was making several crucial errors. He was asking the wrong questions, misunderstanding the minister's responses, and failing to mention provisions in the regulations that could work in his favor. The conversation was becoming counterproductive, potentially damaging his relationship with one of the key officials who could help resolve his crisis. Finally, ended the call with a frustrated goodbye, having accomplished nothing productive. He sat back in his chair, looking more defeated than ever. "That was a complete waste of time," he muttered to himself. "How am I supposed to resolve this situation when I can't even have a proper conversation with these people?" Maria had been wrestling with her conscience throughout the phone call. She had watched struggle with a conversation that she could have conducted effortlessly, and she had heard opportunities for resolution that completely missed. Her professional instincts were screaming at her to intervene, but treatment of her made her reluctant to expose herself to further humiliation. But as she watched bury his head in his hands, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of his crisis, her compassionate nature won out over her wounded pride. She set down her cleaning supplies and approached his desk. "Mr. Wellington," she said softly, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Minister Santos." Looked up, his expression immediately defensive. "So, what's your point?" "I speak Portuguese," Maria said simply, "and I noticed that there may have been some miscommunication during your call." Stared at her for a moment, processing this information. "You speak Portuguese? How do you speak Portuguese?" "I'm from Colombia, and I studied in Brazil for several years," Maria replied, which was true, though it omitted the crucial detail about her doctoral research and her professional relationships with Brazilian officials. "And you understood what Minister Santos was saying?" asked, his tone shifting slightly from defensive to curious. "Yes," Maria nodded, "and I think there may be some opportunities that weren't fully explored in your conversation." Studied her face, trying to reconcile this new information with his assumptions about her background and capabilities. The idea that his maid might have insights into his business crisis seemed absurd, but his desperation was beginning to override his prejudices. "What kind of opportunities?" he asked reluctantly. Maria took a deep breath. This was the moment when she would have to decide how much of her background to reveal, how much help to offer, and whether to trust that could overcome his preconceptions long enough to listen to her advice. "Well," she began carefully, "Minister Santos mentioned several times that the new regulations include provisions for strategic partnerships with local firms. He seemed to be suggesting that foreign investors who establish the right kind of partnerships can not only achieve compliance, but can actually benefit from certain tax incentives and regulatory advantages." Looked at her with surprise. "He said that? I didn't understand. I mean, my Portuguese isn't as strong as I'd like it to be." He also mentioned that there will be a special review process for existing foreign investments, and that investors who demonstrate commitment to local development goals may be able to negotiate modified terms for their projects. Maria continued. But the window for applying for this review is very short. You would need to submit your application within 30 days. 30 days? Repeated. None of my advisors mentioned anything about a special review process. It's buried in the technical language of the regulations, Maria explained, and it requires specific documentation that most foreign firms wouldn't think to prepare. Was staring at her now with an expression she had never seen before. For the first time since she had begun working in his house, he was looking at her with something approaching respect. "How do you know all this?" he asked quietly, gestured for Maria to sit down in the chair across from his desk, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier. For the first time since she had begun working in his household, he was looking at her as a person rather than as a piece of furniture that happened to clean his house. "I'm listening," he said, his voice cautious but no longer dismissive. Maria took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to reveal would fundamentally change the dynamic between them. "Mr. Wellington, my name is Maria Santos, and I hold a doctorate in international economics from the London School of Economics. For 20 years, I worked as a senior economic analyst for the World Bank, specializing in Latin American infrastructure development and international investment policy." The silence that followed her words was deafening, stared at her as if she had just announced that she was from another planet. He blinked several times, processing information that completely contradicted everything he had assumed about her. You have a doctorate?" he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Maria nodded. "I speak 9 languages fluently, including Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, Italian, Mandarin, Japanese, Arabic, and English. I have advised governments and multinational corporations on economic policies that have influenced billions of dollars in international trade and investment." His mouth opened and closed several times before he could form words. But you work as a maid," Maria finished for him. "Yes, sometimes life circumstances force us to make choices we never expected to make." The room seemed to spin around as he struggled to reconcile this revelation with his previous assumptions. The woman he had dismissed as ignorant and uneducated was telling him she was one of the most qualified international economists he had ever encountered. "I don't understand," he said weakly. "If you have those qualifications, why are you working as domestic help?" Maria's expression grew sad. "My husband died 3 years ago. He was also an economist, and together we had built a comfortable life. But when he passed away, I discovered that our insurance coverage wasn't as comprehensive as we had believed. Then my daughter was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease that requires very expensive treatments." She paused, collecting herself before continuing. "I tried to find work in my field, but age discrimination is real, especially for women. The positions that were offered to me didn't pay enough to cover my daughter's medical expenses. Domestic work pays well, especially in wealthy households, and it offers the flexibility I need to care for my daughter." Felt like he was falling through space. Every assumption he had made, every cruel word he had spoken, every dismissive gesture came flooding back to him with horrifying clarity. He had not just been rude to a maid. He had been systematically insulting one of the most accomplished economists in the world. "Maria, I don't know what to say," he stammered. "The things I said to you, the way I treated you." "You treated me exactly as you saw me," Maria replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You saw a woman with an accent in a maid's uniform, and you made assumptions about my intelligence and capabilities. You're not the first person to make those assumptions, and you won't be the last." Buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by shame and embarrassment. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. You must think I'm a terrible person." "I think you're a person who made mistakes based on prejudices that are unfortunately common," Maria said. "The question now is whether you want to move forward and focus on solving your current crisis." Looked up at her with hope beginning to replace his shock. "Can you help me? Do you really understand what's happening with the Brazilian situation?" Maria smiled for the first time since had known her. "Mr. Wellington, I helped design the original framework for foreign investment regulations that your current crisis is based on. I know Minister Santos personally, along with most of the other officials who will be implementing the new policies. And yes, I can help you, but we need to move quickly." "What do we need to do?" asked, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by humble eagerness to learn. Maria moved to the whiteboard in his office and began sketching out a strategy. First, we need to understand what the Brazilian government is really trying to accomplish with these new regulations. They're not trying to drive out foreign investment. They're trying to ensure that foreign investment benefits local communities and supports sustainable development. She drew several interconnected circles and began labeling them with key stakeholder groups. The regulations include provisions for strategic partnerships, community development commitments, and technology transfer agreements. If we structure your investment properly, you won't just comply with the new requirements. You'll actually qualify for significant tax incentives and preferential treatment. Watched in amazement as Maria outlined a comprehensive strategy that his expensive consultants had completely missed. She explained the political dynamics behind the regulations, identified key stakeholders who needed to be engaged, and described specific steps that could be taken to not only save his investment, but potentially increase its value. "But how do we implement this?" asked. "My Portuguese isn't strong enough for these kinds of negotiations, and I don't have the relationships you're describing." "That's where my background becomes particularly valuable," Maria explained. "I've maintained professional relationships with many of the officials involved in this process. Minister Santos, for example, would remember me from the infrastructure projects we worked on together. I could facilitate introductions and help navigate the cultural aspects of these negotiations that often trip up foreign investors." Leaned forward, his excitement growing as he began to see a path forward. "Would you be willing to help? Would you consider working with me on this project in a consulting capacity?" Maria paused, considering the offer carefully. "That would depend on several factors. This would require me to temporarily step away from my current responsibilities and focus entirely on your crisis. It would also require you to treat me as a professional partner rather than as domestic help." "Of course," said quickly. "Whatever you need, whatever you want, I'll pay you consulting fees that reflect your qualifications. I'll provide whatever resources you require. I'll—" "Mr. Wellington," Maria interrupted gently, "before we discuss compensation, I need you to understand something. If we work together on this project, you'll need to set aside your preconceptions and trust my expertise completely. There will be cultural nuances and political subtleties that may seem strange to you, but that are essential to success in Latin American business environments." Nodded eagerly. "I understand. I'll defer to your judgment completely. And you'll need to be prepared for the fact that I may know more about certain aspects of this situation than your other advisors," Maria continued. "That may be difficult for you to accept, given our previous dynamic. After what I've learned today, I'm prepared to accept that you know more about this situation than anyone else I could possibly hire," admitted. "In fact, I'm beginning to realize that I've been incredibly lucky to have you in my house, even though I was too blind and prejudiced to see it." Maria studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. What she saw was genuine remorse and desperate hope. She made her decision. "All right," she said. "I'll help you, but we'll need to work as equal partners, and you'll need to follow my lead on the cultural and political aspects of this project." "Done," said immediately. "What do we do first?" Maria looked at the clock on the wall. "First, we call Minister Santos back, but this time I'll do the talking. We need to schedule a meeting with him as soon as possible, preferably in. We'll also need to reach out to several other key stakeholders, including the governor of state, the head of the local development authority, and representatives from the major labor unions involved in infrastructure projects." "Labor unions?" asked with surprise. "Community support is essential for project approval under the new regulations," Maria explained. "The Brazilian government wants to ensure that foreign investment creates local jobs and supports community development. Union endorsement can be extremely valuable in demonstrating that commitment." As Maria outlined the strategy in more detail, found himself marveling at the sophistication of her analysis and the depth of her knowledge. She spoke about Brazilian politics and economics with the authority of someone who had spent years immersed in these issues, and her insights were far more nuanced and practical than anything his expensive consultants had provided. "How long do you think this process will take?" asked. "If we move aggressively, we could have a preliminary agreement in place within 3 weeks," Maria replied. "But it will require intensive work, and you'll need to be prepared to travel to Brazil for face-to-face meetings." "Whatever it takes," said. "I can't tell you how grateful I am that you're willing to help me, especially after the way I treated you." Maria looked at him seriously. Mr. Wellington, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because I'm good at solving these kinds of problems and because my daughter's medical treatments are expensive. But I also want you to learn something from this experience. What do you mean? Asked. I want you to think about how many other people you've dismissed or underestimated based on their appearance or their circumstances, Maria said. I want you to consider how many opportunities you might have missed because you made assumptions about people's capabilities. Was quiet for a moment, processing her words. You're right. I've been blind and arrogant, and it's probably cost me more than just money. It's cost me the chance to learn from people who might have had valuable insights to share. That's a good start, Maria said. Now let's focus on saving your investment. We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it. As Maria began making phone calls to her contacts in Brazil, watched in amazement as she switched effortlessly between languages and navigated complex political relationships with ease. She spoke with authority and confidence, commanding respect from officials who had been difficult for to reach. Within 2 hours, Maria had scheduled meetings with 3 key government officials, arranged introductions to potential local partners, and outlined a preliminary compliance strategy that addressed all the major requirements of the new regulations. It was more progress than a team of consultants had made in 3 days of intensive work. Maria said during a brief break in her phone calls, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond words. But more than that, I owe you a debt of gratitude that I'll probably never be able to fully repay. You can repay me by treating people with respect regardless of their current circumstances, Maria replied, and by paying my consulting fees so I can continue caring for my daughter. Smiled, the consulting fees won't be a problem. As for treating people with respect, I think I'm about to learn that lesson very thoroughly. What didn't yet realize was that his education was just beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, Maria would not only save his billion-dollar investment, but would teach him lessons about humility, respect, and the danger. 3 weeks later, Wellington stood in the marble lobby of the Brazilian Ministry of Infrastructure Development watching Maria Santos command the room with quiet authority. She was dressed in an elegant business suit, her graying hair styled professionally, and her credentials prominently displayed on a lanyard around her neck. The transformation from Maid to international economist was complete, but for the real transformation had been his own. The past 3 weeks had been the most educational of his life. He had watched Maria navigate Brazilian politics with skill that his expensive consultants couldn't match. She had conducted meetings in flawless Portuguese, leveraged relationships built over decades of professional service, and crafted solutions that addressed not just the legal requirements of the new regulations, but the underlying political and social concerns that had motivated them. More importantly, had begun to see the world differently. As they traveled through, Maria had introduced him to community leaders, labor representatives, and local business owners who would be affected by his development project. For the first time, began to understand that his investments weren't just financial instruments. They were forces that could improve or damage the lives of real people. Mr. Wellington, Minister Santos said in accented English as he approached them in the lobby, it is a pleasure to meet you finally. Dr. Santos has told me so much about your project and your commitment to community development. Shook the minister's hand, still marveling at the respect and warmth with which Maria was greeted by every official they encountered. The pleasure is mine, Minister Santos. I'm grateful for your willingness to work with us on finding a solution that benefits everyone involved. As they were escorted to the conference room, reflected on how different this meeting was from his earlier phone conversation with the minister. Then, he had been a frustrated foreign investor trying to protect his financial interests. Now, thanks to Maria's guidance, he was a partner in a comprehensive development strategy that would create thousands of local jobs, transfer valuable technology to Brazilian firms, and establish educational programs that would benefit the community for generations. The conference room was filled with stakeholders that Maria had insisted be included in the final negotiations. There were government officials, local business leaders, university representatives, and community advocates. 3 weeks earlier, would have seen this as an unnecessary complication. Now, he understood that their support was essential not just for regulatory compliance, but for the long-term success of his project. Ladies and Minister Santos began in Portuguese, with Maria providing simultaneous translation for We are here today to finalize an agreement that represents a new model for international investment in Brazil. This project demonstrates that foreign capital and local development goals can work together to create shared prosperity. Over the next 4 hours, the group worked through the final details of the agreement. This investment would be restructured as a joint venture with 3 local firms, creating a partnership that satisfied the new foreign ownership requirements while bringing valuable local expertise to the project. The development would include affordable housing units, a technical training center, and a fund for ongoing community development programs. But the most remarkable aspect of the agreement was the financial terms. Thanks to Maria's understanding of the tax incentives and regulatory advantages available under the new system, his restructured investment would actually be more profitable than his original plan. The special review process that Maria had identified would provide his project with preferred status, accelerating approval timelines and reducing regulatory costs. As the final documents were signed, found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he had been facing the loss of $800 million and the destruction of his reputation. Now, he was celebrating an agreement that would not only save his investment, but increase its projected returns by 30%. After the ceremony concluded, and Maria found themselves alone in a quiet near the ministry building. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as they sat with coffee, finally able to relax after weeks of intensive negotiations. Maria said, his voice filled with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. You've saved my company, but more than that, you've taught me things I should have learned years ago." Maria smiled, the warmth in her expression reflecting the professional satisfaction of a job well done. "You've learned quickly, Mr. Wellington. 3 weeks ago, you saw this crisis as a problem to be solved. Now you understand it as an opportunity to create something meaningful." "I understand a lot of things differently now," admitted. "I understand that intelligence and education come in many forms, and that my assumptions about people were not just wrong, but dangerous. I understand that real success isn't just about making money, it's about creating value for everyone involved." He paused, looking out at the bustling streets of. "I also understand that I've been incredibly fortunate to have you in my life, even though I was too ignorant to recognize it." "What will you do differently when we return to California?" Maria asked. Had been thinking about that question for days. "First, I'm going to restructure how my company approaches international investments. I want you to lead a new division focused on sustainable development projects that benefit local communities. I want to create a model that other companies can follow." "And personally," Maria pressed, "personally, I'm going to try to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes," said. "I'm going to listen more and assume less, and I'm going to remember that the most valuable expertise often comes from the most unexpected sources." Maria nodded approvingly. "Those are good intentions, but intentions are easy to maintain when you're feeling humble and grateful. The real test will be whether you remember these lessons when you're back in your familiar environment, surrounded by people who reinforce your old attitudes." Considered her words carefully. "You're right. That's why I want you to stay involved in my business, not as an employee, but as a partner. I need someone who will challenge my assumptions and keep me honest." "I appreciate the offer," Maria said, "but I have other priorities. My daughter is starting a new treatment program next month, and I want to be available to support her through that process." Leaned forward earnestly. "Maria, with the consulting fees I'm paying you for this project, plus the partnership stake I want to offer you, you'll never have to worry about medical expenses again. You could focus entirely on being with your daughter without any financial stress." Maria's eyes filled with tears as the full implications of his words sank in. For 3 years, she had carried the crushing weight of financial worry, always calculating costs and sacrificing her own needs to pay for her daughter's treatments. The idea of freedom from that burden was almost overwhelming. "The partnership would involve traveling to various project sites," continued, "but we could structure it so that you have complete flexibility to be home when your daughter needs you. You could continue making the kind of difference you made at the World Bank, but with the security and resources to care for your family properly." As they flew back to California the next day, found himself seeing the world through new eyes. The flight attendant who served their meals was a young man who spoke 3 languages and was working his way through law school. The taxi driver who picked them up at the airport was a former engineer from Syria who had been forced to start over in a new country. Each person they encountered had a story, had talents and experiences that would have overlooked just a month earlier. When they arrived at its mansion, the entire household staff was waiting to greet them. Mrs. Carlos, Chef, and the others had heard about Maria's role in savings investment, and they wanted to congratulate her on her success. "Dr. Santos," Mrs. said with a warm smile, "we always knew there was something special about you, but we had no idea how special." As watched the genuine affection between Maria and the other staff members, he realized that they had seen qualities in her that his prejudice had blinded him to. They had recognized her intelligence, her kindness, and her dignity, even when she was cleaning bathrooms and dusting furniture. That evening called an all-hands meeting for his senior staff. The same executives who had struggled unsuccessfully to solve his Brazilian crisis were gathered in his conference room, waiting to hear about the resolution of the situation they had been unable to address. "Ladies and," began, "I want to tell you about the most important business lesson I've ever learned. 3 weeks ago, we were facing an $800 million loss because we failed to understand the complexity of Brazilian investment regulations. Today, we've not only saved that investment, but increased its projected value by over $200 million. He gestured toward Maria, who was seated at the conference table as his equal. This success was made possible by Dr. Maria Santos, who holds a doctorate from the London School of Economics and spent 20 years as a senior analyst for the World Bank. Dr. Santos solved our crisis using expertise and relationships that none of our consultants could match." The room was silent as staff processed this information, many of them recognizing Maria as someone they had seen around the house but had never really noticed. "The reason I'm telling you this," continued, "is to illustrate how dangerous our assumptions can be. Dr. Santos was working in my household for 6 weeks while I paid consultants hundreds of thousands of dollars to solve problems she could have addressed immediately. My prejudice and arrogance nearly cost us hundreds of millions of dollars." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of his executives. "From now on, this company will operate differently. We will seek expertise wherever it exists, regardless of its packaging. We will listen to all voices, not just the ones that come with expensive credentials and prestigious titles. And we will remember that intelligence and wisdom are distributed throughout society, not concentrated in corner offices and boardrooms." Announced that Maria would be joining Wellington Industries as a senior partner, leading their new sustainable development division. He also announced that the company would be implementing new hearing practices designed to identify talent regardless of conventional credentials, and new project evaluation criteria that would consider community impact alongside financial returns. As the meeting concluded and his staff filed out, many of them stopped to introduce themselves properly to Maria, asking about her background and expressing interest in learning from her expertise. The woman they had barely noticed a month earlier was now recognized as one of the most qualified professionals they had ever encountered. Later that evening, as Maria prepared to leave the mansion for what would likely be the last time as an employee, she and stood together in the dining room where their journey had begun. The crystal vase that had triggered cruel outburst had been replaced with a simple arrangement of flowers from the garden. "Maria," said quietly, "I want you to know that breaking that vase was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it gave me an excuse to be cruel to you, but because it started a chain of events that opened my eyes to my own limitations and prejudices." "Sometimes we need our assumptions shattered before we can see clearly," Maria replied. "Your vase was just the beginning of that process." Smiled, "You've taught me that the most valuable people in our lives might be the ones we're most likely to overlook. You've shown me that intelligence and wisdom come in many forms, and that my success depends on my ability to recognize and appreciate the contributions of others." As Maria walked to her car for the last time as Maid, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had come to his house out of desperation, willing to endure humiliation for the sake of her daughter's health. She was leaving as a partner in one of California's most successful companies, with the financial security to care for her family and the professional platform to make a meaningful difference in the world. But perhaps most importantly, she was leaving knowing that Wellington had learned lessons that would make him not just a better businessman, but a better human being. He had discovered that treating people with dignity and respect wasn't just morally right. It was practically essential. He had learned that the most expensive consultants in the world couldn't match the value of genuine expertise combined with personal experience and cultural understanding. As watched Maria drive away, he made a silent promise to remember the lessons she had taught him. He would never again let his prejudices blind him to the potential of the people around him. He would never again assume that someone's current circumstances reflected their capabilities or their worth as a human being. The billionaire who had ridiculed a maid for breaking a crystal vase had discovered that she possessed something far more valuable than anything in his mansion. The knowledge, experience, and wisdom that had saved him from his greatest failure and taught him his most important lessons about success, humility, and the true nature of human worth. From that day forward, Wellington's approach to business and life was forever changed, and the woman he had dismissed as ignorant and uneducated became not just his most trusted advisor, but the person who had transformed his understanding of what it means to truly succeed in life. Of assumptions that would change his life forever. The journey to Brazil would be more than a business trip. It would be a transformation that would make Wellington a better businessman and a better human being. Maria hesitated. She could continue with her simple explanation about studying in Brazil, or she could tell him the truth about her background and qualifications. Either way, she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. "Mr. Wellington," she said finally, "I think we need to have a longer conversation." Arcus Wellington, not because he deserved her assistance, but because solving complex economic problems was what she did best, and because sometimes doing the right thing meant rising above other people's prejudices and small-mindedness. But first, Wellington was about to have the worst night of his life, as the full implications of his crisis became clear, and his expensive advisors proved increasingly unable to provide the solutions he desperately needed. Very next morning,